The afternoon sun of Lower Manhattan filtered through the tall, mullioned windows of The Gilded Page, not as a harsh glare, but as a soft, golden dust that seemed to settle on everything with a reverent hush. The air within was a sacred blend of aged paper, cracked leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of Earl Grey tea that Alara Vance, the store's 70-year-old proprietor, kept warm in a small pot behind the counter. The bookstore was not a place of gleaming modernity. It was a sanctuary of stories, where the floorboards whispered the memories of 1,000 patrons, and the towering shelves held not just books, but the collected wisdom and dreams of generations. Every spine was a silent sentinel, every worn cover a testament to a life lived, a lesson learned. For Alara, this was more than a business. It was the last tangible piece of her husband, Arthur, a fortress of memory built from their shared passion and sacrifice. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the gentle slide of a dust cloth over a first edition of Moby Dick, the careful alignment of a stack of poetry. To an outsider, she was just a quiet old woman, a relic in a relic of a store, a figure as faded and unassuming as the sepia photographs on the wall. But within her, behind eyes that held the placid depth of a calm sea, was a will forged in loss and tempered by a love that death itself could not extinguish. This quiet, almost monastic routine was her armor. It was how she kept the grief at bay, the sharp-edged memory of Arthur's final months. He had been a man of brilliant intellect and boundless optimism, a history professor who saw the best in humanity. That optimism had been systematically dismantled by a predatory real estate scheme that had swept through their neighborhood a decade ago, a financial plague orchestrated by men in sharp suits who spoke of progress while they signed death warrants for small businesses. Arthur had fought, pouring their life savings into a legal battle he was destined to lose. The stress had been a slow poison, culminating in a heart attack that stole him from her far too soon. She remembered the look in his eyes in those last weeks, not of anger, but of a profound, hollowed-out defeat. He felt he had failed her, failed their dream. And the architect of that ruin, a man whose name she had never forgotten, was now the very same man trying to tear down this last bastion of their life together. Her purpose was not vengeance, not in the way the world understood it. It was a quieter, more profound form of justice, to stand her ground, to keep this flame lit, to prove that his legacy, their legacy, was not for sale at any price. The delicate chime of the bell above the door shattered the afternoon's tranquility. It was not the gentle ring of a curious customer, but a sharp, impatient jangle, as if the door itself had been shoved open with contempt. Marcus Thorne filled the doorway, a man whose presence seemed to physically lower the temperature of the room. He was dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored, it looked like a second skin of polished steel. His silver hair swept back with a severe precision that mirrored his worldview. The scent of his cologne, a sharp, aggressive fragrance of sandalwood and ambition, was an immediate assault on the bookstore's gentle aroma. He was flanked by a younger man, an associate in a slightly less expensive suit, who carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of nervous sycophancy. Thorne's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the bookstore not with any sense of wonder, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a demolitions expert assessing a building's structural weaknesses. He didn't see stories or history, he saw square footage, outdated infrastructure, and wasted potential. His polished Italian shoes made a sound on the old wooden floors that was less a footstep and more an indictment. Thorne approached the counter without preamble, his junior associate hovering a respectful step behind. He placed his hands, manicured and heavy with a gold signet ring, flat on the worn oak surface, leaning in as if to assert his physical dominance over the small space. He didn't greet Alara, he simply began. His voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with an undercurrent of profound impatience, the tone of a king addressing a particularly slow-witted peasant. He spoke of a final offer, a number that, while substantial to some, was an insult to the soul of the place. He used words like synergy, redevelopment, and inevitable progress. each term a sterile, meaningless stone thrown against the stained glass window of her life's work. Alara stood perfectly still, her hands resting on a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. She felt her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs, a quiet drum of defiance. She listens to his entire speech without interruption, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering. When he was finished, a thin, self-satisfied smile on his lips, she gave her answer. Her voice was soft, but it carried the unshakable weight of her conviction, a simple and profound refusal that offered no room for negotiation. The shift in Thorne's demeanor was instantaneous. The thin veneer of corporate civility cracked and fell away, revealing the raw arrogance beneath. His smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of disbelief, then of outright fury. He straightened up, his posture radiating indignation.
He was a man who was not accustomed to being told no, especially not by someone he considered so utterly insignificant. He decided, in that moment, to make an example of her, to use her as a teachable moment for his young associate on how to handle sentimental fools. He raised his voice, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet, book-lined space. He began to mock the store, his words dripping with derision. He called it a dusty, worthless mausoleum, a fire hazard filled with the ramblings of dead men. He gestured dismissively at the shelves, at the very soul of her world, and laughed a short, barking laugh. He turned his performance to the few other customers in the store, a young student, an elderly gentleman, ensuring he had an audience for her humiliation. He was stripping away her dignity, piece by piece, right there in the heart of her sanctuary. As his cruel words washed over her, the world outside of Thorne's voice seemed to recede. Alara was no longer just in the bookstore. She was back in that sterile, white hospital room, holding Arthur's hand as his life ebbed away. Thorne's voice, mocking the store's worthlessness, became the voice of the lawyers, the bankers, the men who had told Arthur his life's work was nothing more than a line item on a foreclosure notice. The phrase, clinging to a dead past, struck her not as an insult, but as a dagger twisting into the wound of her grief. In her mind's eye, she saw Arthur's face, etched with a despair so deep it had physically broken him. This man, Marcus Thorne, was not just attacking a building, he was desecrating a grave. He was dancing on the ashes of her husband's spirit. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The grief, a soft and ever-present ache, did not disappear. Instead, it began to crystallize. A fury, so cold and so pure it felt like ice forming in her veins, solidified around the core of her sorrow. Her hands, resting on the book, became unnaturally steady. Her breathing, which should have been ragged with emotion, became slow, deep, and controlled. He thought he was breaking her. He had no idea he was forging a weapon. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to witness an incredible story of resilience unfold in the heart of New York City. But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed to join our community. Thorne, puffed up with his own performance and mistaking her silence for submission, leaned in for the final killing blow. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper, intended to be the ultimate expression of his power and her helplessness. He told her she was a foolish old woman, destined to die alone, buried under a pile of dusty paper that nobody wanted. He told her that her sentimentality was a disease and he was the cure. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous, a final act of desecration in the sacred space. He smiled, a victor smile, and was about to turn and leave, his lesson to his associate complete. It was at that precise instant, as the last echo of his insult faded into the silence, that the bell above the door chimed again. This time, the sound was different. It was not jarring or impatient. It was a single, clear, resonant note, like a judgment being rendered, a sound that seemed to command the very dust motes in the air to stop their dance and pay attention. The man who entered was the antithesis of Marcus Thorne. Where Thorne was sharp angles and polished aggression, this man was a study in stillness and immense contained power. He was large, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, but he moved with a surprising, almost feline grace. His face was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of a life far from boardrooms and balance sheets, and his eyes, dark and watchful, held a deep, ancient intelligence. The atmosphere in the bookstore underwent a seismic shift. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with absolute control. Thorne, who had been preening in his victory, turned to see who had entered. His face, flushed with arrogance just a moment ago, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He recognized the man. Every person of influence in the city recognized Don Costello. The Don, however, did not even glance at him. He ignored Thorne as if he were a piece of furniture, his entire focus, warm and deferential, landing on Ilara. He walked to the counter, took her hand gently in his, and raised it to his lips, before leaning in to kiss her softly on the cheek. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, respectful murmur that filled the silent room. "Madre," he said, "is this man bothering you?" The silence that followed Don Costello's question was not empty. It was a dense, heavy substance that filled every corner of the gilded page, pressing down on the occupants with a physical weight. Marcus Thorne, a man who commanded boardrooms with the force of his voice, found he had no air in his lungs. His mind, usually a sharp and ruthless calculator of profit and loss, was a chaotic storm of denial and terror. He saw the scene, but could not process it.
The most feared man in the city, a figure spoken of in hushed, terrified whispers, was kissing the cheek of this insignificant old woman, calling her Madre. It was a tear in the fabric of his reality, a glitch in the well-ordered universe where power flowed from wealth and influence, not from some inexplicable bond with a relic in a failing bookstore. His carefully constructed world, built on the predictable subservience of the weak, was tilting on its axis, and the vertigo was nauseating. He tried to form a word, an apology, a dismissal, anything to regain control, but his throat was a knot of useless muscle. Ilara, for her part, did not look at Thorne with triumph. There was no glint of victory in her eyes, only a profound and weary sorrow. She felt the warmth of the Don's hand still holding hers, a familiar anchor in the storm of the present moment. His question, "Is this man bothering you?" hung in the air, but she knew it was a formality. The answer was already written in the history of a decade of silent grief. Her gaze finally settled on Thorne, and she saw him not as a titan of industry, but a hollow man, a ghost who had haunted her life for 10 years. She saw the architect of her husband's despair, the unseen force that had crushed Arthur's spirit long before his heart gave out. The fury that had crystallized within her moments before was not a hot, burning rage. It was a cold, clear certainty, the dispassionate focus of a surgeon about to excise a tumor. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was its own verdict, a confirmation more damning than any accusation. Don Costello released her hand gently, his movements economical and deliberate. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, his full attention settled upon Marcus Thorne. The shift was absolute. The warmth and deference he had shown Ilara vanished, replaced by an unnerving stillness, a predatory calm that was infinitely more terrifying than any overt display of anger. His eyes, dark and unreadable, did not glare at Thorne. They assessed him, cataloged him, and dismissed him, all in the space of a single, drawn-out second. Thorne felt that gaze like a physical pressure, an invisible force pinning him to the spot. It stripped away his expensive suit, his polished confidence, his billions of dollars in assets, leaving him exposed and utterly powerless. The junior associate, who had been watching his boss's performance with a mixture of awe and fear, took an involuntary step backward, instinctively trying to distance himself from the epicenter of the coming earthquake. Thorne's survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding his paralysis. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. He forced a smile, a ghastly, trembling caricature of his usual confident smirk. "Don Costello," he began, his voice a strained, high-pitched version of its normal baritone. There seems to be a misunderstanding. I was simply negotiating a business deal with the owner. A very generous offer, I assure you." He gestured vaguely toward Alara, as if trying to include her in his desperate lie. He was attempting to reframe the situation in a language he understood, the language of commerce, of transactions, of money. He hoped to appeal to a shared understanding of power, a mutual respect between two influential men. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. He was trying to build a bridge to a man who was already planning to burn his entire world to the ground. Don Costello did not respond with words. He simply raised his right hand, palm facing Thorn, a gesture so simple, so devoid of threat, yet it carried the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Thorn's words died in his throat, choked off by the sheer, unquestionable authority of that small movement. The Don let the silence stretch again, allowing Thorn's pathetic attempt at an explanation to hang in the air and rot. He wanted the developer to feel the full depth of his error, to understand that the rules of his world no longer applied here. This was not a boardroom. This was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The Don's gaze drifted for a moment around the bookstore, taking in the towering shelves, the worn leather chairs, the soft golden light. It was a look of genuine affection, of a man surveying his most prized possession, before his eyes returned to Thorn, now colder than before. "This is not a bookstore, Mr. Thorn," the Don said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Each word was delivered with a chilling precision, devoid of emotion, which only amplified its terrifying weight. The statement was so absurd, so contrary to the evidence of Thorn's own eyes, that for a moment he thought the Don was insane. He was standing in a bookstore. He could smell the old paper. He could see the titles on the spines. But the certainty in Costello's voice planted a seed of doubt, a creeping dread that the reality he perceived was only a thin veneer over something much older and more dangerous. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, as the Don's words began to dismantle his perception of the world, brick by brick. "This," the Don continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to Thorn, "this is my bank." The word landed like a physical blow. A bank? Thorn's mind reeled. His empire was built on a complex web of finance, of loans and leverage, of capital flowing through legitimate channels. The idea that this dusty, anachronistic shop could be the financial heart of the city's most powerful criminal organization was preposterous, yet the look in Costello's eyes told him it was the absolute truth. He thought of the endless streams of cash that must flow through the Don's hands, untraceable, unrecorded. He imagined the ledgers, not of book sales, but of debts owed and favors granted, all managed from this quiet, unassuming location. The store was not a relic. It was a fortress of secrecy, a brilliant, audacious front hiding in plain sight. The Don was not finished. He gestured with his chin toward the back of the store, where a simple curtain separated the main room from a private office. "It is my office," he added, his voice dropping even lower. "My home." The words twisted the knife deeper. Thorn hadn't just insulted a business owner, he had trespassed. He had brought his corporate filth into a man's home, a sanctuary. He had threatened the one place where a man like Costello could find peace. The personal nature of the offense was now terrifyingly clear. He had not made a business misstep. He had committed a mortal sin. He had violated a sacred space, and the punishment for such a transgression, he knew, would be biblical. His mind flashed with images of his own sterile, glass-walled penthouse apartment, a place of cold luxury, and contrasted it with the warm, lived-in soul of this room. He had mistaken warmth for weakness. Then came the final, devastating pronouncement, the one that sealed his fate. The Don looked from Thorn to Alara, and for a moment the hint of warmth returned to his eyes as he gazed upon her. Then he turned back to Thorn, his expression once again a mask of cold judgment. This bookstore, Mr. Thorne, is the heart of my entire organization, the central nervous system of everything I control in this city. He paused, letting the magnitude of that statement sink in, letting Thorne comprehend the sheer, suicidal scale of his arrogance. "And you," the Don said, his voice now barely a whisper, "have just insulted the queen of this kingdom." The words echoed in the profound silence. The queen. Not the owner, not the manager, the queen. It was a title of such reverence, such absolute authority, that it shattered the last vestiges of Thorne's composure. The world seemed to drop away from beneath Marcus Thorne's feet. The floorboards, which had felt so solid moments before, now seemed like a precarious raft on a bottomless ocean. The carefully ordered hierarchy of his life, with him at the apex, had been inverted. He was nothing, less than nothing. He was a bug, an annoyance who had wandered into the throne room and spat in the face of the monarch. His junior associate had now backed away completely, his face a mask of pure terror, his portfolio clutched to his chest like a flimsy shield. He was trying to make himself invisible, to sever any connection to the man who was now, for all intents and purposes, a dead man walking. The other customers, who had been frozen in place, now seemed to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple argument. They were watching the complete and total annihilation of a powerful man. Thorne began to tremble. It started in his hands and quickly spread through his entire body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. A cold sweat drenched his custom-tailored shirt, plastering it to his skin. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not an old woman, but an immovable object, a figure of immense, quiet power, whose true nature he had been too blind and arrogant to perceive. He saw the quiet dignity that he had mistaken for weakness, the resilience he had mocked as foolish sentimentality. He had been playing checkers, while she, and the terrifying force standing beside her, had been playing a game of chess so complex and far-reaching that he couldn't even comprehend the board. He had lost before he had even sat down at the table. Ilara watched him break. She felt no pleasure, no surge of vengeful satisfaction. Instead, a wave of profound melancholy washed over her. She saw in his collapsing face the same hollowed-out shock she had seen in Arthur's eyes after the foreclosure notices had arrived. It was the look of a man's world had been irrevocably shattered, whose belief in his own agency had been exposed as a comforting illusion. For a brief, fleeting moment, she almost felt a sliver of pity for him. But then, the memory of Arthur's funeral, of the cold, hard finality of the earth being shoveled onto his coffin, rose in her mind, and the pity vanished, replaced by a grim, stony resolve. This was not revenge. This was balance. A debt being paid in full, a cosmic scale being righted after a decade of injustice. Don Costello watched Thorne's disintegration with a detached, almost clinical interest. He had seen powerful men break before, but there was a certain satisfaction in this particular instance. It was clean. It was poetic. Thorne's own hubris had been the instrument of his downfall. He had walked into the lion's den and tried to sell the lion a cage. The Don let him stew in his terror for another long moment before he spoke again, his tone shifting from declarative to narrative. It was the tone of a historian recounting a sequence of events that had already been set in motion, a story whose ending was already written.
He was no longer passing judgment. He was simply reading the verdict that Thorne himself had authored. "I know who you are, Marcus Thorne," the Don said softly, and the statement was not a boast, but a simple fact. "I know everything about you." He began to walk slowly, circling Thorne like a shark, his movements fluid and menacing. "You see, when you first sent your initial offer letter to this store, when you first tried to bully your way in here, I became curious. It is my business to be curious about men who throw their weight around in my city. So I had some people, very thorough people, look into your past. all the way back to the beginning. The implication was clear. The Don's reach was long, his memory infinite. There were no secrets he could not unearth. Thorne's mind went blank with a new, more specific kind of fear. His past was not pristine. It was littered with ruthless deals, hostile takeovers, and ethically dubious maneuvers that had built his fortune. But those were business. They were, in his mind, the cost of success. He had always been careful, always operated within the gray areas of the law, always ensured there was a plausible deniability. He believed his history was buried under layers of legal paperwork and non-disclosure agreements, safe and secure. He could not have been more wrong. The Don's people did not concern themselves with legal barriers. They dealt in truths that were far more absolute and far more dangerous. Your first major development project, the Don continued, his voice a low, steady murmur, was a decade ago. A little initiative you called Urban Renaissance, a charming name. You targeted a neighborhood not far from here, full of small, family-owned businesses, a bakery run by the Schmidt family for 3 generations, a tailor shop owned by a man named Petrov, a small grocery, a hardware store. With each name, the Don was painting a picture, resurrecting the ghosts of Thorne's past and bringing them right into the room. Thorne could almost smell the bread from the bakery, see the bolts of cloth in the tailor's window. These were not abstract concepts. They were lives he had casually destroyed on his climb to the top. He had forgotten their names, of course. They were just entries on a spreadsheet, obstacles to be removed. But Don Costello had not forgotten. He spoke their names as if he had known them personally, his voice imbued with a quiet respect for their memory. He detailed the methods Thorne had used: predatory loans with impossible terms, zoning challenges filed through shell corporations, a campaign of intimidation and harassment designed to bleed the owners dry until they had no choice but to sell their properties for a fraction of their worth. He laid out Thorne's entire playbook, the blueprint of his greed, with a precision that was both masterful and terrifying. He was exposing the rotten foundation upon which Thorne had built his entire life. Alara listened, her heart aching with a sorrowful recognition. Every tactic the Don described was a fresh twist of the knife in the old wound. She remembered the late nights Arthur had spent poring over legal documents, his face pale with stress. She remembered the threatening letters, the endless phone calls from aggressive lawyers, the slow, systematic dismantling of their financial security and their peace of mind. She had lived through this story, but hearing it articulated now, in this quiet, book-lined room, gave it a new and terrible clarity. It was not just a series of unfortunate events. It was a deliberate, calculated campaign of destruction waged by the man standing before her, trembling and broken. The Don stopped his slow circling and stood directly in front of Thorne, his presence completely eclipsing the developer. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for Thorne's ears alone, yet it seemed to fill the entire store. You ruined dozens of families with that scheme, Mr. Thorne. You built the first floor of your empire on their bankruptcies, on their despair. Most of them just faded away. But there was one man, a history professor, a brilliant, optimistic man who believed in the good of people. He fought you harder than anyone else, poured every last cent he had into fighting your lawyers, trying to save not just his own dream, but the soul of his community. A flicker of something, not quite recognition, but a vague, uneasy familiarity crossed Thorne's face. A history professor. The detail was a tiny key, turning a long rusted lock in the deep recesses of his memory. He had dealt with so many holdouts, so many sentimental fools who refused to see the inevitability of progress. But there was something about that one, a stubbornness that had been particularly irritating at the time. He had made a point of crushing him completely, of making an example of him. The memory was hazy, indistinct, a minor annoyance from a decade past. He still couldn't recall the name. He didn't need to. Don Costello looked over at Alara,
whose face was now a mask of stoic grief. A single, silent tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, a testament to a pain that had never truly healed. The Don's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a look of profound empathy and shared sorrow, before he turned back to Thorn, his eyes now blazing with a cold, righteous fire that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. He did not need to raise his voice.
The quiet intensity of his words was more powerful than any shout. He was about to deliver the final, killing stroke, the revelation that would connect the past to the present and seal Thorn's doom forever. "He was a good man," the Don said, his voice thick with a controlled emotion that was more menacing than any threat. "A man who loved this store more than anything in the world, except for his wife. He believed that books held the collective memory of humanity, that this place was a sanctuary against the kind of soulless greed that you represent." The Don paused, letting the weight of his words press down on Thorn, forcing him to see the human cost of his ambition. "You didn't just take his money, Mr. Thorn, you took his hope. The stress of fighting you, of losing everything he had built, put him in an early grave. His name was Arthur Vance." The name landed in the silence of the room like a dropped coffin. Arthur Vance. The connection was made, a brilliant, blinding arc of electricity between the past and the present. Thorn's mind, which had been reeling, suddenly became terrifyingly clear. Alara Vance, Arthur Vance, the wife, the widow. It all clicked into place with the horrifying finality of a prison door slamming shut. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hadn't just insulted a random old woman. He had, through some cosmic, malevolent twist of fate, walked back to the scene of his very first major crime and threatened the one person on Earth who had the most reason to want him destroyed. And he had done so in the presence of the one man who had the power to make it happen. Thorn stared at Alara, his eyes wide with a dawning, comprehensive horror. He saw it all now, the quiet defiance, the unshakable refusal to sell. It wasn't sentimentality, it was a silent, decade-long vigil. This bookstore wasn't just a legacy, it was a monument, a memorial to the husband he had destroyed. And he, in his infinite arrogance, had tried to tear it down. He had danced on the grave of Arthur Vance, mocked his memory, and threatened his widow, all while standing in the very heart of her protector's kingdom. The sheer astronomical odds of such a self-destructive act were staggering. It was as if his own greed had developed a consciousness, leading him by the hand to this precise spot for his own execution. Alara met his terrified gaze, and for the first time since the dawn had arrived, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, not angry, not triumphant. It was quiet, steady, and laden with the weight of 10,000 lonely nights. "He loved this store," she said softly, her words a simple, heartbreaking echo of the Dawn's. "You took him from me, and then you came back for the last piece of him I had left." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a final, simple epitaph for her husband, and a closing argument in the trial of Marcus Thorn. There was nothing more to be said. The case was closed. The verdict was in. Don Costello placed a comforting hand on Alara's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and protection. He then looked back at Thorn, whose entire body was now slick with a sheen of cold sweat, his face the color of ash. The developer's mind was a whirlwind of escape routes, of legal options, of powerful people he could call. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that none of it mattered. The power Don Costello wielded operated in a different sphere, beyond the reach of lawyers and judges. It was a primal, fundamental power, and he had just committed an unforgivable offense against its very source. "You see, Mr. Thorn," the Don said, his voice returning to its calm, instructional tone, as if explaining a simple but important lesson to a child. "You made two mistakes. Your first was underestimating the power of memory. You thought the past was dead and buried, that the people you stepped on would just stay down. But the past is never dead. It just waits."
He let that sink in before delivering the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, the one that explained everything. Your second mistake was thinking this was a random encounter. It wasn't. You didn't just walk into a bookstore, Mr. Thorne. He leaned in one last time, his voice a low, chilling whisper that would haunt Thorne's nightmares for whatever was left of his life. You walked into a memory, the Dawn hissed, the words dripping with a cold, final promise of retribution. And memories, especially the ones that belong to the people I love, have a way of collecting their debts, with interest. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war and a sentence of death all in one. The trap had been sprung. The stage was now set not for a negotiation, but for the complete and utter dismantling of Marcus Thorne's life, piece by painful piece. Thorne looked from the Dawn's implacable face to Alara's quiet, sorrowful strength, and he understood. He was not a player in this game. He was the board, and he was about to be broken. His empire, his wealth, his reputation, they were all just pieces to be swept away. Collateral damage in the service of a justice that had been waiting patiently for a decade. The quiet little bookstore, which he had seen as a worthless relic, was in fact a courthouse, and the session had just begun. He opened his mouth to plead, to beg, to offer anything, but no sound came out. It was too late. The time for words was over.
The Dawn straightened up, his demeanor shifting once more. The quiet intensity was replaced by a brisk, businesslike finality. He gave a subtle nod to the entrance, and two large men, who had been standing unnoticed outside the entire time, entered the store. They were dressed in simple, dark suits, their faces impassive, their presence filling the remaining space with an air of quiet, professional menace. They moved to stand on either side of Thorne, not touching him, but their proximity was a cage more secure than any iron bars. They were not there to inflict violence. They were there to bear witness, to ensure the sentence was carried out. The junior associate, seeing the two men enter, finally broke. He let out a small, terrified squeak, turned and practically fled from the store, his portfolio forgotten on the floor. He ran out into the afternoon sun of Lower Manhattan, leaving his boss, his mentor, to face his fate alone. His departure was a silent, final confirmation of Thorne's complete isolation. All the sycophants, the partners, the allies he had cultivated over a lifetime of ruthless ambition had vanished. In the end, he was utterly and completely alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the architects of his future ruin. Ilara watched the young man flee, and a flicker of sadness crossed her features. She saw in him a younger version of Thorne, another soul on the verge of being corrupted by the same insatiable greed. Perhaps this day, this terrifying lesson would be his salvation, a chance to choose a different path before it was too late. It was a small, hopeful thought in a moment heavy with grim finality. She turned her attention back to the scene before her, her resolve hardening once more. The process of justice was now in motion, an unstoppable force she had unknowingly set in motion with a single act of kindness decades ago. Don Costello addressed Thorne one last time, not with anger, but with the cold, dispassionate tone of an auditor closing a file. "Your life, as you know it, Mr. Thorne, is over," he stated simply. "The process has already begun. Phone calls have been made, information has been shared. The foundations of your world are already crumbling." He was not just making a threat. He was describing a reality that was unfolding in real time, far beyond the walls of the bookstore. He was revealing that the confrontation was merely a courtesy, a chance for Thorne to understand why his world was ending before it was gone completely. The weight of those words was absolute. Thorne could feel it in his bones, the distant, seismic tremors of his empire collapsing. He imagined his lenders, his investors, his partners, all receiving phone calls from quiet, persuasive men, all being shown evidence of his crimes, all severing their ties to him in a desperate act of self-preservation.
He had built his kingdom on a network of trust and fear, and he knew that Don Costello commanded a much deeper, more potent version of both. His network was being dismantled, his power being unplugged at the source, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The two large men remained still, their presence a constant, silent pressure. The store was quiet again, but this was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb, the quiet after the final nail has been hammered into the coffin. Thorne's arrogance, his confidence, his entire identity had been stripped from him, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. He finally understood the central theme of the story he had blundered into, that some debts can never be outrun, and that the quietest places often hide the most formidable power. Ilara took a deep, steadying breath, the air no longer smelling of just old paper and tea, but of a long-delayed, bitter justice. The weight that had settled on her shoulders since Arthur's death, a burden of grief and unresolved anger, began to lift ever so slightly. It was not a moment of joy, but of closure. A chapter, written in pain and loss, was finally coming to an end. The path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time in a decade, it was not shrouded in the shadow of Marcus Thorne. Her husband's legacy was safe. The Gilded Page would stand. The Don gave a final, almost imperceptible nod to his men. Then he turned to Ilara, the coldness vanishing from his face as if it had never been there, replaced once again by the warm, deferential respect of a son for his mother. He gently took her hand again, his touch a silent promise that she would never have to face such a threat alone again. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore felt more sacred than ever. The next stage of Thorne's downfall was about to begin, a systematic demolition that would unfold in boardrooms and courtrooms across the city. But the true climax, the moral victory, had already happened right here, among the silent, watchful stories on the shelves. Don Costello's words settled over the room not like a sound, but like a change in the atmospheric pressure, a sudden, crushing weight that made the very air thick and difficult to breathe. Marcus Thorne felt it in his chest, a physical constriction that mirrored the catastrophic collapse of his internal world. His life, a meticulously constructed edifice of power, influence, and untouchable wealth, was imploding from the inside out, its foundations revealed to be nothing more than the forgotten grief of this.
He stared at Ilara, and the image of the frail, sentimental old fool dissolved, replaced by something terrifying, an arbiter of a justice so patient and so absolute that it defied all the rules of the world he knew. The gold signet ring on his finger suddenly felt cold and heavy, a shackle binding him to his own history. The scent of aged paper in the bookstore, which he had mocked just minutes ago, now seemed like the dry, dusty smell of an ancient tomb being sealed with him inside, a monument to his own spectacular, self-inflicted ruin. Ilara met his gaze, and the profound sadness in her eyes was a more damning verdict than any fury could ever be. She did not see a vanquished foe. She saw the final, pathetic act in a tragedy that had begun a decade ago. The trembling man before her was a ghost, a hollowed-out echo of the unseen, malevolent force that had haunted her life and broken her husband's heart. There was no catharsis in his terror, no joy in his unraveling. There was only the solemn, weary finality of a long-overdue debt being collected. Her mind drifted back to Arthur, not to his final, gasping breaths in the sterile hospital room, but to a sun-drenched afternoon years earlier, right here in this store, when he had found a rare first edition of a history text, and his face had lit up with a pure intellectual delight. That was the man Thorne had destroyed. That was the light he had extinguished. And this grim spectacle, this dismantling of a soulless empire, was not a celebration, but a requiem, a final, somber note played in honor of a life that had been stolen far too soon.
The Don's hand remained on Alara's shoulder, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He had watched Thorne's psyche crumble, the arrogance peeling away like cheap veneer to reveal the panicked, insubstantial man beneath. He took no overt pleasure in the sight, displaying only the detached satisfaction of a master strategist watching a complex, long-running plan reach its inevitable conclusion. He had set the pieces on the board years ago, not out of a desire for conflict, but out of a deep, abiding sense of loyalty. Now he was simply explaining the rules of the game to his opponent after the checkmate had already been called. His gaze shifted from Alara's sorrowful face back to Thorne's ashen one, and he began to narrate the mechanics of the developer's destruction, his voice calm and methodical, like a professor delivering a lecture on the irreversible laws of cause and effect, a lecture that would serve as Thorne's corporate and personal obituary. The investigation, the Don explained, had not been a matter of brute force or intimidation. It had been a work of art, a slow, meticulous archaeological dig into the buried ruins of Thorne's life. When Alara had first mentioned the developer's name months ago, a quiet complaint about the increasingly aggressive buyout offers, Costello had not reacted with immediate anger. He had reacted with curiosity. He had dispatched not thugs, but a team he referred to as his librarians, a quiet group of men and women who were masters of the unseen world of information. They were former forensic accountants, disgraced investigative journalists, and brilliant data analysts who operated in the shadows, their only allegiance to him. They did not break doors. They found the keys that had been left under the mat, the digital backdoors left unlocked, the faint electronic whispers that told the true story behind the pristine facade of Thorne's public relations. The first thread they pulled was the Urban Renaissance Project. The Don described how his people had spent weeks in the dusty, climate-controlled archives of the city's municipal building, not looking for a single damning document, but for patterns. They scanned and digitized thousands of pages of zoning applications, property transfer deeds, and incorporation papers for dozens of shell companies. They built a timeline, a complex, interconnected map that showed how Thorne's web of anonymous entities had systematically encircled the neighborhood, isolating the small businesses one by one, cutting them off from suppliers and financing, like a wolf pack methodically separating a calf from the herd. Thorne could almost see the web being woven around his past, each connection a silken thread of doom, tightening with every word the Don spoke, a net from which there was no escape because it was made of his own history. There were, of course, dead ends. The Don spoke of a holding company based in Panama, a black hole of corporate law designed to swallow assets and erase ownership trails. For a month, it seemed like the most crucial evidence, the direct link between Thorne's personal finances and the predatory loans, was lost forever in that legal abyss. But Thorne's arrogance, the Don explained, had a consistent flaw: his contempt for the people he considered his inferiors. He had fired a long-serving executive assistant 5 years ago over a trivial matter, refusing her a severance package he felt she had earned. He had forgotten her name the moment she walked out the door, but she had not forgotten him. The Don's people found her, living a quiet life in upstate New York. They didn't threaten her, they simply listened. And she, for the price of a respectful ear, gave them everything.
She told them about a secondary, private ledger Thorne kept, a vanity project where he detailed his conquests, a document stored not on a corporate server, but on an old, forgotten laptop in a storage unit in Queens. The acquisition of that laptop, the Don recounted, was a simple matter. The storage unit's rental fee was several months in arrears, a trivial oversight for a man like Thorne, but a fatal one. A simple payment to the facility manager, a man with his own gambling debts, was all it took. Inside that laptop, beneath layers of mundane files, was the Rosetta Stone of Thorne's crimes. It was a detailed accounting of the Urban Renaissance project, complete with notes in the margins in Thorne's own digital handwriting, mocking the very people he was bankrupting, including a particularly dismissive entry about a stubborn history professor who refused to understand the concept of inevitable progress. Reading those notes, the Don explained, was the moment this ceased to be a simple matter of protecting Alara's store and became a crusade. It was the moment Thorne's fate was irrevocably sealed, his own words serving as his death warrant. As the Don spoke, Alara felt a quiet, profound sense of validation. She remembered the countless times Arthur had tried to explain the complexity of Thorne's scheme to lawyers and city officials, how his carefully researched evidence was dismissed as the paranoid rambling of a desperate man. He had seen the truth, but no one with the power to act would listen. They saw only the polished, successful Marcus Thorne, a pillar of the business community, a creator of jobs and progress. They could not see the rot beneath the surface. Now, in this quiet room, the truth was finally being given voice, not in a sterile courtroom, but from the mouth of a man whose power was more fundamental than any legal statute. Arthur was being vindicated, his name cleared not in the public record, but in the higher court of karmic justice. And for Alara, that was the only verdict that had ever truly mattered. The Don's narrative then shifted from the past to the very recent present, and his voice took on an even colder, more clinical edge. The information from the laptop was not just a record of past sins, it was a key. It contained account numbers, passwords, and the names of offshore bankers and compromised politicians. It was the blueprint to Thorne's entire corrupt enterprise. Over the last several weeks, while Thorne was busy sending threatening letters to a bookstore, the Don's people had been using that blueprint to systematically plant charges at every critical load-bearing point of his financial empire. They weren't preparing for a battle, they were setting the stage for a controlled demolition, one that would be triggered not by a single explosion, but by a series of quiet, devastating phone calls. Thorne began to feel a creeping, retroactive dread. He thought back over the last month, a series of seemingly unrelated misfortunes he had dismissed as the normal friction of business. A lucrative deal in Dubai that had inexplicably fallen apart at the last minute. A trusted board member who had abruptly resigned for personal reasons. A line of credit from a Swiss bank that had been suddenly and without clear explanation reduced. He had seen these as individual problems to be managed, fires to be put out. He now understood they were not random events. They were the preliminary tremors of the earthquake to come, the careful, precise snipping of support wires before the main cable was cut. He had been a dead man walking for weeks, and in his blindness, he had not only failed to see his own doom, but had sprinted happily toward it, right into this very room. The tension in the bookstore became a palpable thing, a thick, heavy blanket of impending doom. The few other customers who had been frozen in place since the Don's arrival had long since slipped out, leaving only the central players in this final grim act. Thorne's Italian leather shoes, which had seemed so powerful and authoritative when he had entered, now felt like blocks of cement, anchoring him to the spot of his own execution. The beautiful, golden light filtering through the windows no longer seemed warm and inviting, but rather like the harsh, accusatory glare of a spotlight in an interrogation room. Every book on every shelf seemed to be a silent juror, their worn spines a collective testament to the histories and human stories that he had so arrogantly dismissed as worthless. The world had been reduced to this single room, a stage where the final scene of his life was being dictated to him. Alara watched the last vestiges of Thorne's composure evaporate under the cold, steady torrent of the Don's words. She saw the flicker of comprehension in his eyes as he connected the dots of his recent misfortunes, the dawning horror as he realized the true scale of the forces arrayed against him. There was a part of her, the gentle, empathetic soul that had defined her entire life, that felt a pang akin to pity. It was the pity one feels for a creature caught in a trap of its own making, a wild animal that has chewed its own leg off in a desperate, futile attempt to escape. But the feeling was fleeting, burned away by the memory of Arthur's face, pale and gaunt in the fluorescent hospital lights, his spirit already gone long before his body finally gave up the fight. Thorne had shown no pity then.
He had shown no mercy. He was simply reaping, at long last, the bitter harvest of the seeds he himself had sown.
The Don paused, letting the silence stretch, allowing Thorne to fully absorb the terrifying reality of his situation. He was not just facing a single powerful enemy. He was facing a ghost, an army of accountants, and the full crushing weight of his own sordid history, all orchestrated by a man who moved through the world like a force of nature. He had built an empire of glass and steel on a foundation of broken lives, and now the architect of that foundation's revenge had arrived to call in the moral debt. The Don was not just a gangster, he was a restorer of balance, a human embodiment of a cosmic law that Thorne had believed he was wealthy enough to ignore, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. His decade of unchecked avarice was about to be balanced in a single, catastrophic afternoon. Finally, the Don laid out the irrefutable proof, the single piece of evidence that elevated Thorne's actions from the realm of the unethical to the blatantly criminal. He described a recorded phone call, retrieved from the old laptop's deleted files, between Thorne and a city councilman who had been instrumental in pushing through the zoning changes for the Urban Renaissance project. The audio quality, the Don noted with a hint of professional appreciation, was pristine. On it, Thorne could be heard laughing, explicitly detailing the bribery scheme and mocking the sentimental fools who were about to lose their livelihoods. He even named one of them directly, Arthur Vance, the egghead professor who thought a petition could stop a bulldozer. The existence of that recording transformed Thorne's situation from a financial crisis into a federal crime, a one-way ticket to a prison cell. Thorne's breath hitched in his throat. He remembered the call. He remembered the arrogance, the feeling of absolute invincibility. It was a conversation he had believed was as ephemeral as spoken words, lost to the ether forever. To learn that it had been preserved, a digital ghost waiting in the machine for a decade, was to understand that he was not just unlucky, he was haunted. He was being undone by his own voice, his own hubris, a permanent record of his own corruption. The cold, hard reality of prison, a place he had only ever seen in movies, a place for other people, for the poor and the careless, was now a tangible, looming certainty. The fine fabric of his suit felt coarse against his skin, a poor substitute for the rough institutional cotton he would soon be wearing. The stage for the final checkmate was now fully set, and the Don proceeded to describe with the same chilling calm the moves that had already been made that very morning. He explained that a secured, encrypted digital package containing the laptop's entire contents, including the audio recording and the private ledger, had been delivered anonymously to the lead white-collar crime prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Simultaneously, a second package detailing Thorne's extensive tax evasion had found its way to a particularly ambitious agent at the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. He was being attacked on two fronts by two separate federal agencies, ensuring that even if he managed to escape one net, the other would undoubtedly hold. There would be no escape, no plea deal, no quiet retirement in a non-extradition country. Then came the financial kill shot. The Don described a series of phone calls that his associates had made, starting at 9 a.m. sharp, to the chief risk officers of every major financial institution that held Thorne's debt. These were not threats. They were, the Don explained, quiet, friendly conversations, advisories, in which certain pieces of information were shared. Evidence of massive undisclosed liabilities, proof of fraudulent asset declarations, a gentle suggestion that Thorne's entire portfolio was a house of cards about to be hit by a hurricane of federal indictments. By 10:30 a.m., every single one of his institutional lenders had invoked the material adverse change clauses in their loan agreements. Every note was called, every line of credit was frozen. His liquid assets were gone, his empire rendered instantly insolvent. Ilara listened to this systematic annihilation, and a single silent tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of joy, nor of sorrow. It was a tear of release. It was the physical manifestation of a decade of grief, of anger, of a profound sense of injustice finally leaving her body. It was the tear Arthur could never cry, the one he had buried under a brave face until it had finally broken his heart.
She reached up and wiped it away, her hand steady. The ghost that had haunted the periphery of her life for 10 long years was finally being exorcised, not with a whisper, but with the thunderous collapse of a corrupt world. The process was brutal, total, and in its own grim way, it was beautiful. It was the closing of a circle, the final line in a long and painful chapter. Thorn stood in the center of the room, a man hollowed out, the life and arrogance drained from him, leaving only a vessel of pure, unadulterated terror. He was no longer a real estate developer, no longer a titan of industry. He was a defendant, a bankrupt, a future inmate.
He looked around the quiet bookstore, at the towering shelves of silent witnesses, and he finally understood. He had not walked in to conquer a piece of property. He had walked into his own judgment day. He had trespassed in a sanctuary, mocked its queen, and in doing so, had brought the full, righteous wrath of its hidden king down upon his own head. The quiet dignity of this worthless old store had proven to be an infinitely more powerful force than all the billions in his now frozen bank accounts. The Don concluded his lecture, his voice as even and steady as it had been when he began. He had laid out the entire plan, not to gloat, but to ensure Thorn understood the totality of his defeat, to make him comprehend that this was not a random act of violence, but a direct and proportional response to his own actions. He had sown the wind a decade ago when he had destroyed Arthur Vance's life. And now, standing in the very heart of Arthur's legacy, he was reaping the whirlwind. The investigation was complete. The evidence was delivered. The plan was in its final, irreversible stage. The only thing left was for Marcus Thorn to watch as the world he had built on the suffering of others was burned to the ground. The smoke from its ruins, a final, fitting tribute to the memory of the man he had so carelessly destroyed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and in the profound, ringing silence of the gilded page, the full weight of the coming conclusion settled upon everyone. Thorn's ruin was no longer a future possibility. It was a present, unfolding reality. His partners were abandoning him, his lenders were suing him, and federal agents were likely already drawing up the warrants for his arrest. The confrontation was not the beginning of the end. It was simply a notification that the end had already happened. Ilara took a slow, deep breath, the air in her lungs feeling cleaner and lighter than it had in years. The quiet hum of the city outside the bookstore's windows sounded different now, not like the relentless noise of a world that had forgotten her husband, but like the gentle, steady pulse of a world where justice, however long it took, could still be found. What was the most satisfying moment of Marcus Thorn's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. The Don gave a final, subtle nod, a signal that the audience was over. The two large men who had entered earlier, who had been standing as statues, took a single, synchronized step forward. They did not touch Thorn, but their movement was a clear and final dismissal. His presence was no longer required. He was free to leave, to walk out of the bookstore and into the smoldering ruins of his own life. He was a ghost now, haunting the living for a few more hours before the authorities would come to claim his body. The true punishment was not the prison sentence or the bankruptcy. It was this moment of perfect, horrifying clarity, the understanding that his entire life had been a monument to a greed so profound that it had consumed itself. He stumbled backward, his legs weak and uncoordinated. He turned, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, a stark contrast to the sharp, decisive stride with which he had entered. His eyes were vacant, staring at the front door as if it were the entrance to another dimension, a world he no longer recognized and in which he had no place. He did not look back at Ilara or the Dawn. To do so would be to acknowledge the source of his own annihilation, a truth his shattered ego could not possibly bear. He was a king who had been shown, in no uncertain terms, that his crown, his castle, and his entire kingdom had only ever been an illusion, a dream from which he had just been brutally, irrevocably awakened. As his hand touched the cool brass of the doorknob, the bell above the door chimed softly.
the same sound that had announced his arrogant arrival. But now it sounded different. It was not a herald of his power, but a tolling, a final, gentle note marking the end of his era. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the blindingly bright afternoon, a man stripped of everything: his wealth, his power, his future, his very identity. The city he had once seen as his personal chessboard was now a hostile, alien landscape. He was no longer a player. He was not even a pawn. He was simply gone, erased from the board by a quiet, powerful move that he had never seen coming. A move that had been planned in a dusty old bookstore he had dismissed as worthless. Inside the Gilded Page, the atmosphere began to return to its normal peaceful state. The heavy, charged energy of the confrontation dissipated like smoke, leaving behind the familiar, comforting scent of paper and tea. The golden light once again seemed warm and benevolent. Don Costello turned to Alara, the fearsome, calculating strategist vanishing completely, replaced once more by the quiet, respectful boy she had taken in all those years ago. He gently took both of her hands in his expression one of deep, sincere concern. He had brought a storm into her sanctuary, a necessary violence to excise a cancer. But his only wish now was to restore her peace, the peace that this man had stolen from her and her husband a decade before. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a quiet, unshakable strength. She gave his hands a gentle squeeze, a gesture of gratitude that transcended words. The battle was over.
The war that had been waged in the silence of her heart for 10 years had finally been won. Arthur's memory had not just been protected, it had been avenged. Her bookstore, this small, quiet corner of the world that was her last connection to him, was safe. It would stand not just as a monument to his passion, but as a testament to the idea that the deepest loyalties and the quietest dignities were forces more powerful than any corporate empire, more enduring than any fortune built on the ruin of others. Her gaze drifted around the room, across the spines of the thousands of books that were her silent, steadfast companions. Each one contained a story of struggle, of loss, of love, of eventual triumph or tragedy. Her own story, she realized, had finally reached its denouement. It was a sad story in many ways, marked by profound loss, but it was not a tragedy. It was a story of resilience, of a love that transcended death, and of a single act of kindness that had echoed through the decades, returning when it was needed most as an unshakable shield. She was the keeper of these stories, and now her own story would take its place among them, a quiet testament to the enduring power of a well-lived, well-loved life. The future of the Gilded Page was secure, no longer a fragile flame flickering in the winds of corporate greed, but a steady, burning beacon. Ilara Vance, the quiet old woman whom Marcus Thorne had seen as a worthless relic, stood as the victor, not through wealth or power in the way the world understood them, but through her unwavering commitment to memory, to love, and to the legacy of a good man. Her ascension was not to a throne of gold, but to her rightful place as the quiet, respected heart of her community, the untouchable matriarch of a kingdom built not of bricks and mortar, but of stories, loyalty, and a justice that had at last been served. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and in the profound, ringing silence of the Gilded Page, the full weight of the coming conclusion settled upon everyone. Thorne's ruin was no longer a future possibility, it was a present, unfolding reality. His partners were abandoning him, his lenders were suing him, and federal agents were likely already drawing up the warrants for his arrest. The confrontation was not the beginning of the end, it was simply a notification that the end had already happened. Ilara took a slow, deep breath, the air in her lungs feeling cleaner and lighter than it had in years. The quiet hum of the city outside the bookstore's windows sounded different now,
not like the relentless noise of a world that had forgotten her husband, but like the gentle, steady pulse of a world where justice, however long it took, could still be found. She looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, a man who now seemed to shrink within his expensive suit, and she felt the final, heavy chains of her decade-long grief begin to dissolve. It was not a feeling of triumph, but of liberation, a quiet internal dawn after a seemingly endless night of sorrow and memory. Don Costello gave a final subtle nod, a signal that the audience was over. The two large men who had entered earlier, who had been standing as statues, took a single synchronized step forward. They did not touch Thorne, but their movement was a clear and final dismissal. His presence was no longer required. He was free to leave, to walk out of the bookstore and into the smoldering ruins of his own life. He was a ghost now, haunting the living for a few more hours before the authorities would come to claim his body. The true punishment was not the prison sentence or the bankruptcy. It was this moment of perfect, horrifying clarity, the understanding that his entire life had been a monument to a greed so profound that it had consumed itself. He stumbled backward, his legs weak and uncooperative, the fine motor skills that had signed billion-dollar deals suddenly betraying him. His mind, once a fortress of ruthless calculation, was now a hollow chamber echoing with the Don's final words. He was a king who had been shown, in no uncertain terms, that his crown, his castle, and his entire kingdom had only ever been an illusion, a dream from which he had just been brutally, irrevocably awakened. As his hand touched the cool brass of the doorknob, the bell above the door chimed softly, the same sound that had announced his arrogant arrival. But now it sounded different. It was not a herald of his power, but a tolling, a final, gentle note marking the end of his era. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the blindingly bright afternoon, a man stripped of everything, his wealth, his power, his future, his very identity. The city he had once seen as his personal chessboard was now a hostile, alien landscape. The towering skyscrapers no longer looked like monuments to his ambition, but like cold, indifferent headstones in a graveyard of his own making. He stumbled backward, his legs weak and uncooperative, the fine motor skills that had signed billion-dollar deals suddenly betraying him. His mind, once a fortress of ruthless calculation, was now a hollow chamber echoing with the Don's final words. He was a king who had been shown, in no uncertain terms, that his crown, his castle, and his entire kingdom had only ever been an illusion, a dream from which he had just been brutally, irrevocably awakened. As his hand touched the cool brass of the doorknob, the bell above the door chimed softly, the same sound that had announced his arrogant arrival. But now it sounded different. It was not a herald of his power, but a tolling, a final, gentle note marking the end of his era. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the blindingly bright afternoon, a man stripped of everything, his wealth, his power, his future, his very identity. The city he had once seen as his personal chessboard was now a hostile, alien landscape. The towering skyscrapers no longer looked like monuments to his ambition, but like cold, indifferent headstones in a graveyard of his own making.
The sounds of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the entire vibrant pulse of New York City seemed to mock him, a world that would continue turning without him, a world that had already forgotten his name. He was no longer a player. He was not even a pawn. He was simply gone, erased from the board by a quiet, powerful move that he had never seen coming, a move that had been planned in a dusty old bookstore he had dismissed as worthless just an hour before. What was the most satisfying moment of Marcus Thorne's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. Inside the Gilded Page, the atmosphere began to return to its normal, peaceful state. The heavy, charged energy of the confrontation dissipated like smoke, leaving behind the familiar, comforting scent of paper and Earl Grey tea. The golden light once again seemed warm and benevolent, a gentle benediction upon the room. Don Costello turned to Alara, the fearsome, calculating strategist, vanishing completely, replaced once more by the quiet, respectful boy she had taken in all those years ago. He gently took both of her hands in his
his expression one of deep, sincere concern. He had brought a storm into her sanctuary, a necessary violence to excise a cancer that had been festering for a decade. But his only wish now was to restore her peace, the tranquility that Thorn had stolen from her and her husband. His touch was not that of a mafia boss, but of a son, checking to ensure that his mother was unharmed after the danger had passed, his loyalty an unspoken, unbreakable promise that she would never have to face such a threat alone again. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a quiet, unshakable strength that had been forged in grief and tempered by love. She gave his hands a gentle squeeze, a gesture of profound gratitude that transcended any words she could possibly utter. The battle was over. The war that had been waged in the silence of her heart for 10 long years had finally, definitively been won. Arthur's memory had not just been protected, it had been honored, his name vindicated by an act of loyalty so absolute it had leveled an empire. Her bookstore, this small, quiet corner of the world that was her last physical connection to him, was safe. It would stand not just as a monument to his passion and intellect, but as a living testament to the idea that the deepest loyalties and the quietest dignities were forces more powerful than any corporate balance sheet, more enduring than any fortune built upon the ruin of other people's dreams. The weight on her shoulders, a burden she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it, had finally completely lifted. Her gaze drifted around the room, across the spines of the thousands of books that were her silent, steadfast companions. Each one contained a story of struggle, of loss, of love, of eventual triumph or tragedy. Her own story, she realized, had finally reached its denouement. It was a story marked by profound, heartbreaking loss, but as she stood here in the quiet aftermath, she knew it was not a tragedy. It was a story of resilience, of a love so powerful it had transcended death itself, and of a single, simple act of kindness, giving a hungry, frightened boy a meal and a safe place to read, that had echoed through the decades, returning when it was needed most as an unshakable shield of justice. She was the keeper of these stories, and now her own story would take its place among them, a quiet testament to the enduring, world-changing power of a well-lived, well-loved life. A lesson that could be found not in a ledger, but only in the pages of a book or the chambers of a human heart. The future of the Gilded Page was now secure, no longer a fragile flame flickering in the winds of corporate greed, but a steady, burning beacon, a permanent landmark in a city of constant change. A week later, a quiet, well-dressed lawyer had arrived, informing Ilara that an anonymous benefactor had purchased the entire city block and placed it into a trust under her name, with the sole stipulation that no business could ever be evicted. Her ascension was not to a throne of gold or a corner office, but to her rightful place as the respected and untouchable matriarch of her community. Ilara Vance, the quiet old woman whom Marcus Thorn had seen as a worthless relic, stood as the victor, not through wealth or power in the way the world understood them, but through her unwavering commitment to memory, to love, and to the legacy of a good man. Her quiet dignity had proven to be the most powerful force of all, a silent roar that had brought a titan to his knees. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.